I'd like to spend some time talking about the important distinction between intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. So let me give you an example. It's a great quote from Mark Twain. He's talking about Tom Sawyer, and he said, if Tom had been a great and wise philosopher, like the writer of this book, he would now have comprehended that work consists of whatever a body is obliged to do, and that play consists of whatever a body is not obliged to do. He goes on, there are wealthy gentlemen in England who drive 4-horse passenger coaches 20 or 30 miles on a daily line in the summer because the privilege costs them considerable money. But if they were offered wages for the service, that would turn it into work, and then they would resign. Let's get concrete. Several decades ago, the Swiss government had identified 2 small towns in Switzerland as potential places to put a nuclear waste depository. The government didn't know how the townspeople would react. So 2 University of Zurich researchers asked the residents of the towns. So, here's the quote. Suppose that the National Cooperative for the Storage of Radioactive Waste, after completing some exploratory drilling, proposed to build a repository for low and mid-level radioactive waste in your hometown. Federal experts examine this proposition, and the federal parliament decides to build the repository in your community. Now, in a town hall meeting, the townspeople were asked whether they would accept or reject that proposition. Now, obviously, people are going to be concerned about having the waste facility so close to their homes. But at the same time, it turns out, perhaps out of some social obligation or a sense of national pride, that about 50% of the townspeople agreed to put themselves at risk for the common good and have the waste facility placed in their town. Now, the other half did not. So the other half continued to pose an obstacle for the government. So the researchers tested what seems to be a perfectly rational economic solution. They got a new group of townspeople from the same town, randomly selected. They presented them with the same scenario, but they added this to that scenario. They said, moreover, the parliament decides to compensate all residents of the host community with 5,000 francs. That's about $2,175 per year and per person. This will be financed by all taxpayers in Switzerland. So what do you think happened? From thinking about it from kind of a typical economic way of thinking, offering some money should increase the percentage of people who are willing to accept the waste facility. Because we often assume that one way to get people to do things that are unpleasant is to offer some kind of financial incentive. But now, only 25% agreed to have the nuclear dump in their town. Remember, before a financial incentive was involved, 50% agreed to have the nuclear dump in their town. Now, only 25%. Half. Let me give you another example of something about what happens when you offer to pay people. In one study, Israeli students were asked to take a kind of a short version of the Graduate Management Aptitude Test. This is a test that many graduate students, and I'm sure some of you taking this course, are familiar with. The students were divided into two groups at random. Half were simply encouraged to do their best. The other half were offered a reward, 2.5 cents, for every correct answer. Who does better? Well, the unpaid group, simply encouraged to do their best, beat the paid group by a substantial amount. Now, researchers at the National Institute of Health have discovered one possible reason for this kind of odd paradox here about what's happening when we make money a factor. So they placed participants in something I've described earlier as a functional MRI called an fMRI. And these fMRIs allow people to scan various areas of the brain very rapidly as people perform tasks to see what areas of the brain are most active. And the participants were playing a simple video game. Sometimes the participants, as they played this video game, if they zapped a figure in this little video screen, they'd earn a monetary reward. But other times, a little symbol showed them that there was no money on the line. There would be no reward. Every time money was on the line, a brain region called the nucleus accumbens lit up. But when no money was on the line, that nuclear accumbens area of the brain was very quiet. Now, oddly enough, the nuclear accumbens is generally thought of as being a pleasure center. It seems to be active when we're high on drugs, enjoying sex, enjoying gambling, etc. But it also turned out, in this study at least, that this nuclear accumbens pleasure center was active when people were being offered financial rewards. Now, a few years after that initial study, some neuroscientists at Duke also had participants play a video game in an fMRI. But instead of earning money for themselves, as happened in the initial study, they were told that they were earning money for a charity, which was true. And whenever they were told that they had the opportunity to earn money for a charity, a different area of their brain lit up. It wasn't the nuclear accumbens. It wasn't that pleasure center. It was an area of the brain called the posterior superior temporal sulcus. Don't worry about remembering that. But this is part of the brain. It's often involved in social relations, forming bonds, perceiving others, etc. And unlike some areas of the brain where different parts can be active simultaneously, that nucleus accumbens and posterior superior temporal sulcus generally both can't be highly active at the same time. Either one tends to be highly active or the other one is. So what might have happened in that Swiss nuclear dump survey that I just described to you is that when no money was offered, that altruism center in the brain was involved in neural processing. But when money was involved, when they said, listen, we can give each townsperson some money, then that pleasure center, rather than the altruism center, became involved. Nucleus accumbens became involved. And although it's active, the $5,000 franc offer was probably too little to really excite that pleasure center enough to win people's support. So, two different areas of the brain operating, and it changes when we offer people money. There's also research that shows that when people are offered very large rewards for completing tasks, their performance sometimes declines. I'm not arguing that it always declines. I want to be clear on that. But it sometimes does decline. And one of the reasons why that happens is that when a lot of money is at stake, people kind of get a kind of a performance anxiety. They're so focused on winning, and they're so focused on doing whatever they can to make sure they do not lose the possible large reward, that actually distracts them, and they don't perform optimally. This effect has been found in lab studies. It's also been found in a series of clever studies that Dan Ariely from Duke did in villages in India. So imagine you're facing a deadline at work, and you desperately need a coworker to stay until 10 at night to help you with the project. What might work better? Should you explain your predicament and ask for a favor? Or should you offer to pay your coworker some money, maybe $30, to stay a few hours extra? I'm going to come back and talk about that point in a separate video lecture on social norms. I want you to ponder that for a minute. There's another thing to think about. I don't know if you're like me. I listen to some PBS and NPR stations. As an example, in Philadelphia, I listen to a station called WRTI, which is a public radio station out of Temple University. And like a lot of public radio stations, by the way, it plays, I love the station. It plays classical music during the day and jazz at night. Great station, in case you're interested. I think it's 90.1. Anyways, in a lot of these fundraisers that these kinds of stations do, if you call in and you offer some money, they'll offer you something like a mug or a book or a tote bag or an umbrella or a DVD as a way of thanking you for your donation. And the question is, does that seem like a good thing to do? Or might it have some weird effect? Because now are you wondering whether or not you're giving the money out of the goodness of your heart, or are you wondering whether you're really just doing it to get the tote bag or the mug or the book or the DVD? And might that affect your willingness to give? Another example of this intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation could be seen in a simple story. Imagine your child wins a science fair at school. You're surprised, your child is surprised, it's very exciting. And as a way of kind of congratulating your child, you take the child to Disneyland or Disney World for a day. Well, that seems good. In other words, when the child was working on the task, they weren't extrinsically motivated. They didn't know that they were going to go to Disneyland or Disney World if they won. They were just working on it because they were really intrinsically interested in that task. But what if a parent had done something different? What if the parent had said to the child, as they were working on this science fair, if you enter this science fair and you win, we'll take you to Disney World? Well, chances are the child's going to react really differently to those two circumstances, and different brain centers will be involved in processing things. So, key thing, takeaway here: intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. We cannot always assume that offering an extrinsic reward, such as money, will motivate people, increase their motivation, or enhance their performance. I'm not arguing that extrinsic rewards are never helpful. That's not true. But we shouldn't assume as a default that the way to engage people is usually to simply offer them some money. Sometimes that not only doesn't help, it actually makes things worse. And in another separate video lecture, I'm going to talk about a related concept, not exactly the same, a related concept called social norms.